Two keys on a table. One opens a door, the other hides a secret. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Tell me where you're listening from. Your comments always light up this journey. Now let's begin. The day had begun with rain. Not a heavy, theatrical downpour, but that steady, unrelenting drizzle that made the gutters overflow and darkened the stones along the boulevard Richelieu. From his office window, Maigret watched the drops slide down the glass in crooked little rivers, blurring the outlines of the chestnut trees outside. He had his pipe in hand, though it was unlit, and his jacket hung loosely on the back of his chair. It was the sort of morning where nothing pressed, nothing demanded, and yet one felt vaguely burdened, as if the dampness itself seeped into the bones. Madame Maigret had reminded him before he left the apartment that he should have taken his heavier coat. He hadn't. And now, each time he thought of stepping outside, he felt a quiet reluctance. He had no pressing case to occupy him, only paperwork, signatures, and the dull administrative routine that was meant to keep the wheels turning. He had just signed the last of a pile of requisitions when the telephone rang. It was nothing urgent. A constable reporting the recovery of a stolen bicycle. Another call followed, this one about a drunk brawling in a bar near Les Halles. Maigret listened, nodded, gave a few brief instructions, and hung up. None of it seemed worth leaving his office for, and yet there was a peculiar sensation hanging over him, as though something had shifted imperceptibly in the city's rhythm. He couldn't have explained it, but he often felt it before anything happened. A wrong note in a familiar song. A silence too long in a room where people had been speaking. He stood, went to the window again, and lit his pipe at last. From here, the rain looked almost like smoke, blurring the figures of people who hurried along with umbrellas angled against the wind. A clerk passed, his hat pulled low. A woman in a plain coat clutched a loaf of bread against her chest. Nothing extraordinary. When the knock came on his door, he called, "Entrez." Inspector Janvier stepped in, damp at the shoulders, with that energetic politeness of his. He placed a folded slip of paper on the desk. "A message, Chief. From the station at Place d'Italie. They thought you might want to see it." Maigret took the note without hurry. It was brief. Unusual occurrence. Small boarding house. Tenant found dead at table. 2 identical keys left beside him. No sign of forced entry. He read it twice, then laid it flat with his large hand resting on it. Janvier shifted, waiting for his reaction. Maigret did not rise at once. Instead, he tapped out his pipe against the ashtray, methodical, calm. "Where is it exactly?" "Rue de la Glacière, not far." The rain had not let up, and the prospect of leaving his warm office did not entice him. And yet, 2 identical keys, side by side on a table, beside a dead tenant. There was something there. Not a crime, necessarily. Not yet. But a story. And Maigret knew from experience that stories left behind by the dead often spoke more loudly than the evidence of the living. He put on his coat at last, though he still regretted not choosing the heavier one. He said nothing more to Janvier, only motioned with his pipe that they should be off. Outside, the drizzle clung to his cheeks, and the world smelled of wet stone and coal smoke. Maigret pulled his hat lower, not to hurry, but to move at his own measured pace toward whatever awaited him in that modest boarding house on Rue de la Glacière. The city was full of mysteries, most of them small, most of them never reaching the papers. A quarrel over rent, a widow too lonely, a lodger too proud. But sometimes, in such places, the whole weight of human folly and sorrow revealed itself with the simplicity of 2 keys left on a table. And so Maigret walked on, pipe unlit again, rain soaking into the brim of his hat, his mind already quietly circling around the image of those keys. The building on Rue de la Glacière was one of those narrow, resigned houses that seemed to lean a little under the rain, its courtyard smelling faintly of damp coal and cabbage water. A uniformed constable waited in the entry with his kepi tucked against his ribs, as if to keep it dry, even indoors. He nodded at Maigret and Janvier, without insisting on ceremony. There was a notice board with curling advertisements, rooms to let, a seamstress on the 3rd floor, a piano lessons card whose ink had bled where a drop of rain had fallen long ago. They climbed the staircase at an unhurried pace. It was dim and clean in the way of places where cleaning had become habit, not pride. The banister wiped with a cloth that had left a dull sheen, a pail and rag set neatly outside a door as if to remind the house who really kept it going. From somewhere above came the sound of a radio turned low, a man's voice reading the news to a room that probably wasn't listening. On the 1st floor landing, a stout woman with a shawl and practical shoes waited, hands clasped at her apron. She had the anxious, purposeful look of a person who had been giving directions for an hour. When she saw Maigret's hat and the heavy set of his shoulders, she lowered her voice without being asked. "I'm the landlady, Chief. Madame Tirard. It's just here. He was a quiet one, you know. Paid on time. No trouble." Maigret said. He did not ask who he was yet. He let the woman lead. Silence with Madame Tirard was like a soft broom. She swept her words into it to fill the space. "Never brought anyone home. Or perhaps once, but I wasn't watching the stairs. I don't watch the stairs, you understand. People come, people go." They stopped at a door where a damp mark in the paint suggested a hand often rested there on returning. The lock was an ordinary one, round and slightly scarred. A second keyhole below it had been painted over years ago and forgotten. Inside, the room had the particular neatness of someone who had learned not to extend himself beyond a few possessions. A narrow bed with a grey blanket tucked in with care. A washstand with a cracked blue basin and a towel folded squarely. A small stove, 2 plates stacked. A knife that had been sharpened unevenly for years. The window was shut, the pane beaded with moisture on the inside so that the world outside was only shapes and lights. On the table, covered with oilcloth, polished by elbows and the weekly sponge, a man sat as if he had run out of the will to finish a thought. His head had come to rest at an angle against his shoulder, and one hand lay open on the tabletop, a finger touching a sugar lump. Beside the open hand lay 2 small keys, identical, their nickel heads dulled by use. They were placed side by side, a finger's width between them, as if someone had made a point. The little notches on their shanks matched exactly. No ring, no label. Just the 2 of them there, plain and obstinate. Janvier stood near the door and kept quiet. The constable hovered in the corridor, his presence like a piece of furniture no one wanted to move. Madame Tirard lingered in the threshold, the shawl gathered tightly now, as if she were cold. Maigret did not speak for a while. He took off his hat and set it on the bed, then drew his pipe from his pocket and turned it in his big fingers without lighting it. He let the room come to him. There was a smell of weak coffee, not fresh, and something like liniment or cheap soap. The stove was cold, but the ash inside had been stirred recently. The grey bones of yesterday's fire lay in a new pattern. On the washstand, a small bottle of aspirin with 2 tablets left. The alarm clock on the table had stopped at 7:20, but the alarm pin had not been set. He stepped closer to the table and looked at the man without touching him. The face was a kind you saw on tramways and at the counter of government offices. Thin skin stretched over modest bones, a mustache trimmed too carefully. There was no sign of struggle. The collar was fastened, the tie knotted with the kind of care that suggested a mirror had been used even if the mirror wasn't good. The shoes were on his feet, polished in the rough way a cloth gives rather than a brush, and the soles were dry. Madame Tirard spoke again, unable to hold her tongue against the quiet. "He's Monsieur Bruce, Etienne, from the Auvergne. He works at the paper wholesaler on Boulevard de Port-Royal. He sometimes left at 8:15. Today I hadn't seen him come down. I knocked. No answer. I have a master key in case of fire. Well, for everything, and I opened. He was like this. What time? Maigret asked, not looking at her. 9:15. I called the police at once. I didn't touch a thing. Maigret's eyes moved to the keys again. Identical, placed, not dropped. A man coming home late and careless might toss a key on a table, but two keys do not land side by side, each respecting the other's small territory. He imagined the gesture, a hand laying one key, then, after something that had the character of an ending, laying the second. He pointed with his pipe, a motion rather than a question. He had two. He asked for a second, months ago, Madame Tirard said quickly. For the building door, I thought. He said sometimes he misplaced things. I gave him one for his room, one for the door. They're the same, mind you. The locksmith made them for the building. They open both. We don't have much in the way of security here. So 2 keys that open the same locks, Maigret said, almost to himself. He looked at the door. There was no chain. The latch was simple. He tried the keys with a gentleness that felt like politeness to the dead. Each turned in the room's lock with the same soft click. He set them back where they had been, with the space between, as if he were not a man, but a shadow passing through the scene, and the scene did not want to be disturbed. Janvier leaned toward the window, his breath fogging the inside of the cold glass. The doctor? In the back, Madame Tirard said, lowering her voice further. He's the neighborhood one. He came before you. He said. She hesitated, as if to repeat a doctor's words was to risk being wrong. He said it was not a heart, that he could not say anything more. He talked of waiting. Good, Maigret murmured. He did not like conclusions given in rooms like this. Rooms tightened under conclusions. People hardened. He preferred the air to move. He bent, not to inspect the body, but to look under the table. The floor was clean. No scuffs from a chair being knocked back in alarm. One of the chair's legs had a folded matchbox under it to steady the wobble. The matchbox was for a brand sold at the tabac on the corner. The green man with the red flame smiled up at him. On the stove, a spoon had been rinsed but not wiped. A faint smear of something white clung to the bowl's edge. Milk? He sniffed the cup on the table. Coffee with a little milk. Sugar untouched. In the saucer, a faint ring where a second cup might have been set and lifted. Or perhaps his imagination. He turned toward the washstand. The towel was dry, the soap's edge crisp. On the chair beside the bed lay a brown overcoat, folded. He touched the cuff. It was dry, too. He looked at the boots lined neatly beside the chair, old boots with the habit of the same feet, the leather cracked and mended, a faint bloom of polish in the places fingers can reach. He returned to the shoes on the dead man's feet. They had done no work this morning. Outside, the rain had not stopped since dawn, and the city carried it into every hallway on soles and hems. But here, the soles were dry. Who lives next? Door? He asked. A seamstress, Janine Roux. She works nights sometimes. She sleeps until noon if she can. She said she heard nothing. And upstairs, a commercial traveler. He's away. On the ground floor, the caretaker has a room. He's at his work. He won't be back until evening. You said he was quiet, Maigret said. Monsieur Bruce. How quiet? She frowned as if this required exactness. He didn't complain. He didn't say good morning unless you looked at him first. He brought his rent on the first, counted carefully, and once he was short by 2 francs, and he grew very red and produced them from another pocket. He wrote letters on Sundays. He had a sister, I believe, in Montluçon. He took his meals mostly downstairs, but sometimes he warmed soup up here. He went to bed early unless he had a book. Friends? Maigret's tone did not change. The pipe remained unlit in his hand. He nodded to the man at the tabac. He played belote twice a week at the cafe on the corner. He kept to himself. He didn't drink much. I never saw a woman come up. Or if I did, I wasn't watching. She said the last, with the hint of a smile that social decency demands, and then looked at the 2 keys, and her face shut itself down again. The neighborhood doctor entered with the careful step of a man used to constables. His hair was thin and combed, his spectacles fogged at the edges. He greeted Maigret, who returned the greeting with a nod that recognized jobs rather than people. "If you want my opinion, Inspector," the doctor said softly. "It was not sudden. Not a heart, as the lady said. But I can't say more here. He had been sitting like this for some time when she found him. He is not cold, but he is settled. You understand?" "Since when?" The doctor hesitated, looking toward the window as if time lived there. "From early morning, perhaps. 7, 8, not much later." Maigret's glance went again to the alarm clock, stopped at 7:20. He did not say anything. The alarm had not been set. Clocks sometimes stopped because they were old, not because moments mattered. He took a chair and sat, not because he was tired, but because a sitting man is less frightening than a standing one. He placed his hat in his lap, the pipe beside it, and let the room resume its little sounds, the rain whispering on the window, the radio above reading the weather, Madame Tirard's breath like a small bellows. "Tell me how your morning went," he said to the landlady, not looking at her. "From the time you rose." She did. She began with the coal delivery that had not arrived, with the cat that had escaped under the gate, with the milk which had been half water, as it usually was. He did not interrupt. When she reached the moment she had knocked on the door, she repeated herself without noticing, making the knock sound softer with each retelling, as if by gentleness she could change what lay beyond the door. "Did he receive visitors?" he asked when she stopped. "In the evenings. Sometimes someone would come, a colleague perhaps. They sat at the cafe, not here. He wasn't the sort to offer hospitality." "Who has the other 2nd key?" His eyes rested on the 2 on the table. She blinked. "There are spares in the caretaker's drawer. For the building, not the rooms, but for the rooms I keep the master. The tenants have their own. I don't. No, I didn't give another to anyone. Only to him when he asked." Maigret nodded. He turned to January. "Go down and ask at the tabac. How often did he buy matches? Does he smoke? Ask as if you were asking about the weather. And at the cafe? When did they last see him, and with whom? No flourishes." Janvier went out with that light-footed care of his. The constable in the corridor pretended not to listen, and listened. Alone with the landlady and the doctor, Maigret stood again and walked the little distance to the window. He pressed a finger to the pane. Water trembled where he touched. He opened it a notch, and the room's air changed. Nothing dramatic. A small sigh as if the lungs had been holding breath and had decided to draw in a little of the day. The sounds of the street, tires hissing on wet pavement, a woman calling after a child, mingled with the steady drip from the eaves. He closed the window again and wiped his finger on his trouser leg. Thoughtful. He had the feeling, not of danger, but of a mission. Something simple not done. A button unfastened on an otherwise tidy coat. 2 keys where there should have been 1 or none. A cup with sugar untouched and a saucer with the memory of another cup. Shoes too dry for a morning of rain. He did not say, as some might, that it smelled wrong. Smells in Paris rooms were always wrong to someone. Too much soap, too little meat, too many boiled vegetables. What he felt was the wrongness of intention. The keys had been placed to be seen. By whom? A man who thought to leave things in order before ending? A visitor who wished to make a point without leaving a note? "Madame," he said at last, "you'll make some coffee. For yourself and for the young constable. And bring a cup up for us. No need to make it strong." She seemed almost relieved to have an instruction that belonged to life, not death. When she had gone, Maigret sat again and looked at the doctor, who was studying the dead man as if he could will him to explain. "Do you know him?" Maigret asked. The doctor shook his head. "They come and go. I see them when they are ill. Or like this. He had never called me. Good, Maigret said again. He lifted one of the keys a millimeter, then let it fall. The tiny sound it made against the oilcloth was too light to be heard outside the room. He would not hurry. He would sit a while in the boarding house where rain pressed itself into the wood and the lives went on around a man who had stopped. The story would come, not because he chased it, but because people were unable to keep it inside. The tabac owner with his tidy till would talk to Janvier. The seamstress would wake and remember that once the dead man had coughed at 3 a.m, the caretaker would return and complain about something trivial and reveal something important. And the keys, those 2 identical keys, would move from being objects to being answers, not about locks, but about the kind of person who had needed 2, and the kind of person who had wanted them to be seen. When Madame Tirard returned with a tray and the steam of weak coffee, Maigret took his cup and warmed his hands. He looked at the dead man kindly, as if to say that this would be done without humiliation. He waited, listening to the rain, for the first thread to show itself. The coffee was thin but hot, and Maigret drank it without complaint. His hands, broad and deliberate, cupped the chipped porcelain as though he drew warmth not only from the liquid, but from the ritual itself. Madame Tirard sat stiffly on the edge of the bed, twisting the fringe of her shawl, her eyes wandering again and again to the still figure at the table. The doctor had gone, leaving behind only his vague conclusions and a lingering odor of carbolic soap. The room had settled into a silence where every sound carried weight. The tick of the rain against the glass, the shuffle of the constable's boots outside, the sigh of a draught moving beneath the door. Maigret let the silence stretch. He had found that in such silences, people often betrayed themselves. The landlady resisted longer than most. At last, her voice, low and hesitant, broke it. He wasn't unhappy, you know. I would have seen. Some of them, you can tell. They mope, they grow thinner, they drink more than they should. But Monsieur Bruce, he was steady. He nodded good evening. He ironed his shirts on Sundays. He even polished his shoes, though badly. Her words carried a faint defensiveness, as though she were already imagining the police reports, the suspicion that a lodger had ended his own life in her house. Maigret did not correct her. He merely sipped again, his heavy lids half closed, his gaze shifting once more to the 2 keys on the table. The sound of steps in the stairwell drew his attention. Janvier returned, hat and coat beaded with rain, his expression faintly eager. He set himself against the door frame, waiting for permission to speak. "Well?" Maigret asked, without lifting his eyes from the cup. At the tabac, they knew him. He bought his packet of gris every 3 days, regular as a clock, but Janvier hesitated. He hadn't been in for 4 days. The proprietor was certain. Said he thought perhaps Monsieur Bruce had quit smoking. Maigret let the sound hang between them. And at the café, the waiter remembered him last night. He was with a man. They played belote with another pair. Left at 11. The waiter described him as quiet, more quiet than usual even. His companion was not a familiar face. Dark suit, a little threadbare, glasses. They sat together some time before the game, talking little. The waiter thought perhaps they knew each other from work. Maigret set his cup down carefully, aligning it with the saucer. Did he drink? 1 beer, slowly. The other man had a wine. They left together. The waiter thought it odd, since usually Bruce went alone. The rain had quickened outside, a new drumming against the window. Maigret stood, stretching his shoulders inside the too light coat, and moved back to the table. His large fingers hovered above the 2 keys, not touching them now, but considering. "Janvier," he said at last, "find out who this man is. At the wholesaler first, Boulevard de Port-Royal," they said. "Ask quietly. Don't go digging with both hands. A man with glasses, threadbare suit. It will be enough." Janvier nodded, eager to be off again, and vanished down the stairs, his steps brisk against the worn wood. Alone once more with Madame Tirard, Maigret turned toward her. He had not asked her to stay, but she had not left, bound by curiosity and the strange loyalty boarding-house keepers feel toward their tenants, as if their walls had absorbed a share of each life within them. "Last night," he said softly. "You saw him come in?" "I heard the door at a little after 11. I was on the ground floor still. He said good night, that was all. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't cheerful either. Just the same." "No visitor followed him up?" "Number." "He climbed the stairs alone. I would have seen otherwise." Her certainty was too firm, the kind of certainty that masks a gap. Maigret made no remark. Instead, he walked slowly to the stove again and looked at the rinsed spoon, at the faint white trace in the bowl. He thought of the sugar lump, untouched on the table, of the second cup that had perhaps been set down and lifted again. "Did he often have guests here, madame?" "Never," she said quickly. "At least I never saw them." Then she added, more hesitantly, "But he could have, once or twice. People are discreet." He nodded, accepting the contradiction without judgment. He had learned that people lied, not to deceive, but to protect their version of order. He sat once more, the chair creaking beneath him. He drew on his pipe, though he had not filled it, a gesture more than a need, and looked at the body again. Etienne Bruce, clerk from the Auvergne, careful, punctual, solitary. A man with 2 keys. And this morning he had not come down the stairs. The door opened again. A young man entered, thin with the pale face of someone who kept late hours. His hair was uncombed, his jacket too large. He blinked at the scene, at the presence of Maigret, and stammered. I live next door. Janine asked me to tell you she's not yet awake. She works nights, but I heard voices. Is it true?" His eyes darted to the figure at the table, and he stopped. "Your name?" Maigret asked. "Armand. I deliver newspapers in the mornings." "Did you see Monsieur Bruce last night?" Armand swallowed. "I saw him come up the stairs. He was not alone. There was another man, a tall one with glasses. They were speaking low. They went inside. I thought nothing of it. He never had visitors, but it happens." Maigret did not move, did not look toward the landlady, though he felt her stiffen. "What time?" "A little after 11. I'd just returned from my round. They closed the door quietly. That's all I know." Maigret studied the young man for a long moment until the boy shifted uneasily. Then he nodded. "Go. Sleep if you can." When Armand had gone, the landlady opened her mouth as if to protest, then closed it again under Maigret's calm gaze. Her certainty from earlier now seemed fragile, like a glass handled too roughly. The inspector rose, took his hat, and placed it on his head. "Leave the room as it is. No one enters without my word." He gestured toward the 2 keys. "Especially not those." On the landing, the constable straightened. Maigret descended slowly, his hand heavy on the rail, pipe still unlit. Outside, the rain had eased to a fine mist, turning the street lamps to soft halos. The smell of wet stone rose from the pavement, mingled with the faint sweetness of roasted chestnuts from a vendor on the corner. He paused under the dripping eaves and drew a long breath. The picture was forming, not clearly, but like a watercolor left out in the rain, a solitary man, 2 keys, a visitor at 11, a second cup on the table. Not evidence, not proof, only the gentle accumulation of small human details. In such details lay the truth. It would come, not by force, but by waiting, by letting the city itself speak. He turned up his collar against the mist and began to walk toward Boulevard de Port-Royal, where the wholesalers' clerks would be starting their day, carrying ledgers and stacking reams of paper, unaware that one of their number would not be returning. Somewhere among them, a man with threadbare suit and glasses, and the explanation of 2 keys left on a table. And Maigret, pipe between his teeth, walked at his measured pace, prepared to wait until the quiet riddle unfolded itself. The wholesaler's yard on Boulevard de Port-Royal smelled faintly of wet cordage and the sweet, dusty breath of paper. Carts were backed under the awning, their canvas covers pearled with mist, and a boy with a broom was sweeping rainwater into a gutter that refused to accept more. Maigret paused before he went in, watching the men at the loading platform lift reams with that practiced economy of movement that belongs to people whose backs have learned their work. The office windows above were steamed on the inside, the shapes behind them moving like fish beyond a milky glass. Inside, a bell on a spring jangled, too bright for the day. The counter was worn smooth at the places where elbows had rested for years. A young woman with a plait coiled at the back of her head looked up and started to say something rehearsed about deliveries, then saw the hat and the coat and the slow way he filled the entrance and closed her mouth again. "I'm looking for the head clerk," Maigret said. She disappeared with a whisper of skirts and returned with a man who was either anxious by nature or had learned to adopt anxiety as a style. He was neat in the way of ledgers. Narrow tie, collar tight, spectacles kept clean by frequent touching. He introduced himself as Pommier, and then, as if it were necessary to apologize for that name, coughed into his fist. "You have a clerk named Bruce." "Etienne," Maigret said, resting both hands on the counter as if to warm them. Pommier's brow furrowed. "Yes, invoices. He is good, accurate." He looked toward the office door as if to verify that accuracy somehow still lay on the desk untouched. "He has not come this morning, which is, well, not like him." "Since when was he not like himself?" Maigret asked, very mildly. Pommier blinked. "I don't follow." "You said it as if he had established a way and then left it. Has he changed lately? Even by little things?" The head clerk's hand went to his spectacles again. He did seem a little distracted these last days. Nothing that affected the work. He asked for Wednesday afternoon off. He had to see about a form, he said. He returned on time. He coughed less. He used to cough. "Cough?" "From the cigarettes. He told me he had given them up. 4 days ago. He said it with that look people have when they are testing whether anyone will laugh." The bell jangled again, and the plaited girl called to a delivery man, her voice threading around the conversation without interrupting it. Somewhere, a clock struck the half-hour too loudly. "Who did he sit with at lunch?" Maigret asked. "No one," Pommier said at once, then reconsidered. "Sometimes with Lenoir from accounts, or with the purchasing assistant. What is his name? Vacheron. A tall man, the latter. Glasses. From Gentilly. Threadbare suit." The question was asked without emphasis, as if Maigret were remarking on the weather. Pommier allowed himself to look pleased at a point of trivia he could confirm. "Yes, his cuffs. He says it's the fashion, but it is not the fashion. He is a good worker. Numbers." He tapped the air with a small forefinger. "He follows them to the end." "Did you see Bruce leave last night?" Maigret said. "I leave at 6, Pommier replied, a little affronted. "We are not guardians." "Someone saw," Maigret said, not a question. The plaited girl had drifted back within hearing. "He went out with Monsieur Vacheron," she said, as if tidying a sentence left unfinished. "They met under the awning. It rained, and they stood close. To keep dry. They didn't speak much." Pommier looked at her as one looks at an apprentice who forgets her place and says something useful. "Mathilde sees everything," he said to Maigret with a small, careful smile. "Mathilde," Maigret said, turning to her, "did they look at you when you looked at them?" She frowned, considering. Monsieur Vacheron glanced inside as if to see if someone was watching. Monsieur Bruce did not. He kept his face toward the street. They walked to the corner and turned. "To the café?" Maigret asked, thinking of the beer and the wine. To the tram, she said. But I'm not sure. It was raining. I was counting stamps. I had the tray balanced on one hip and the stamps on the other, and I tried not to drop the stamps. He nodded as if that problem were one he too had worried about once. He liked her detail about the tray. It had the ring of a life that was lived. He turned back to Pommier. Where does Vacheron sit? The head clerk hesitated, and then led him through a door into the main office, its warmth instantly fogging Maigret's lenses, though he wore none. Desks stood in rows, each with its private geography of blotters, pens, ink bottles, and dog-eared invoices clipped in piles. The smell of gum arabic and damp wool filled the air. Men bent to their sums, or lifted their heads like cattle in a pasture when the wind shifts. At the far end, under a wall map where the streets of Paris had been pricked with colored pins for reasons no one could any longer explain, a tall man worked with his shoulders slightly hunched above narrow hips. Steel-rimmed glasses caught the light as he looked up. He had the starved elegance of someone who has worn the same suit too long and learned to carry it well out of pride. He saw the police without surprise and without alarm. Something like resignation crossed his face and was gone. Vacheron, Pommier said, nervous now in a way that had to do with proximity to the scene of an interview rather than guilt. This is— I know who it is, Vacheron said gently, as if saving his superior from an embarrassment. He stood, not quickly. You are here about Etienne. You call him by his first name, Maigret observed. In a room like this, Vacheron said, people do not have first names until they have worked side by side for years. Then suddenly they do. We ate our bread together sometimes. He liked the end pieces. There was no romance in the way he said it. He might have been talking about ink. Where did you go after work? Maigret asked. We had a beer, the man replied. At the corner. We played a game of belote with two others, as usual. He lost by a small amount and did not sulk, which is why the others like him. We spoke of the weather and the price of coal. We did not speak of politics. It is easier that way. And then, Maigret's tone did not change. Then we walked to his street. He wished to lend me a book he had insisted I should read, and I do not read quickly. I said another time, he insisted. We went up to his room. He made coffee. I took mine black. He took his with milk. We spoke of nothing. I left at 11:20, perhaps. He was alive when I left. The room behind them had gathered its attention like a cat at a door. Maigret resisted the impulse to move them elsewhere. It was useful sometimes for an office to feel the pressure of a story among its ledgers. You returned something, Maigret said, eyes on Vacheron's face. Not hard, but open. The man's mouth twitched. A key, he said after a second's pause. He had lent it to me weeks ago. The building door opens to the same cut as his room. It is ridiculous, but there it is. He had given me the second so that if he came late I could let myself in and we could go on to the cafe. He was careful. He said he would rather know where the key was than have it in his pocket where he could lose it. I forgot to return it. Yesterday he reminded me. He was precise. You placed it beside his, Maigret said. I did not think about it. There was the one he had laid on the table when he came in, and I put mine beside it. Then we spoke about the book. He did not open the window. He said the room was damp enough without inviting the street. You drank your coffee, Maigret said. I did. He spread his hands as if to show they were steady. Black. He drank his slowly. He had given up cigarettes. He had the face of a man who has decided to be virtuous for a fortnight and is already tired of it. Did he seem fearful? Vacheron considered. He had a way of not answering until his answer was true for him. Not fearful, he said. Preoccupied. He asked me, quite suddenly, if I ever felt watched. I said yes, but that is how one feels in offices where there are more eyes than mistakes. He smiled, but he did not laugh. Why did you not tell Madame Tirard you went up? Maigret asked, still mild. I did not see her, the man said. The hallway was empty. I do not report to landladies, Inspector. If I am to declare every time I go up a stair, I will never get to the top. There was no insolence in the reply, only a statement of a man who had lived in such houses and knew their economies of speech. A cough behind them. A thin officer in a damp overcoat had appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands like a penitent's. Lognan. His gloom preceded him as usual, a small weather system of dissatisfaction. They said you were here, Lognan observed to Maigret, as if an accusation had been confirmed. A death at Rue de la Glacière. Nothing to see, but since you have your nose in it already. He let the phrase fall like a wet handkerchief. Good morning, Lognan, Maigret said, and it sounded sincere. You have spoken to the doctor. I have spoken to a doctor who says nothing. They never do. The room is tidy. There is coffee. There are keys. There is the landlady who did not see what she saw. It is all very ordinary, which is why it is probably something else. He stopped, surprised at having said as much of his own accord. Vacheron, Maigret said, as if introducing them for tea. Monsieur Lognan of the brigade. The tall man inclined his head. He did not volunteer more. Do you mind if we look at your desk? Maigret asked after a moment, not as a challenge, but as if the desk might be as interested as they were. Vacheron stepped aside. On the blotter, a small ledger lay open, columns of numbers precise to the last centime. A drawer slid without complaint and revealed a penknife, a string, a clean handkerchief folded twice. Another drawer held nothing but a clean envelope on which an address had been written and then struck out. The address showed through the scratching, Mademoiselle Bruce, Montluçon. The line of the M had the tremor of a borrowed hand. He asked me for the address, Vacheron said before they could ask. He wanted to send something registered and didn't trust his memory. I wrote it down for him, and then he said he remembered and did not need it. I crossed it out because I do not like loose ends. Yesterday? Lognan asked. Yesterday. Do you know what he wanted to send? Maigret said. A letter, or a small envelope. He had nothing else with him. Pommier, who had drifted closer, cleared his throat. The mailroom boy took a registered letter to the post in the afternoon. For Monsieur Bruce. He asked for the receipt to be kept in the drawer until he returned. It is still there. He produced it with the air of a man who brings a towel at the right moment. The slip was damp from his pocket, but the ink held. The address, written in a hand that tried to be neat, was indeed Montluçon. The time showed 4:30 yesterday. Maigret folded the receipt in his large fingers and then unfolded it again. Thank you, he said to no one in particular. You will tell the boy not to lose things on the way to the post office. It would be a pity to trust him and then be disappointed. He let his eyes return to Vacheron. When you left him, he said quietly, was the second key on the table? Yes, the man said, eyes steady. I did not take it with me. And did he expect anyone else? I would not know. He did not say, I expect someone else. People rarely say such things. They stood a moment in a stillness broken only by the rasp of a pen somewhere and the grate of a chair's leg on old floorboards. The office resumed its breath around them, cautious at first, then forgetting its own caution. Lognan, Maigret said, you will go to Montluçon by telephone, see if there is a sister and whether she has received a letter that will not yet have arrived. And ask her what it says. Lognan's mouth turned down. They never tell us what letters say. They say it is private. Ask if she expected a letter, Maigret said, as if that were a different matter altogether. Ask what he would send registered. He turned to Pommier. And you will give me the addresses of your gentlemen who wear threadbare suits and glasses. It is a short list. It is a shorter list every winter, Pommier murmured, surprising himself. Outside, the mist had turned again to rain. When Maigret stepped back into the yard, the boy with the broom was still persuading the gutter to accept a world's worth of water, and doing it with a stubbornness that had its own dignity. The inspector stood under the awning a moment and filled his pipe carefully, tamping the tobacco with the pad of his thumb. He did not light it. He thought of two keys side by side like a paired decision: to trust and to return trust. He thought of a rinsed spoon with a smear of milk, of shoes too dry for the morning, of a man who had given up cigarettes for 4 days and had asked a friend whether he felt watched. It would be easy to hurry, to decide the coffee had done the work, that a visitor had been unwise or unkind. But easy had never been useful. Instead, he let the rain tick on his hat and the day grow heavier around him, and he decided to go back to Rue de la Glacière the long way, past the tabac and the café where men played belote in their damp coats, to sit in the room again and see whether the keys on the table said the same thing now that he knew whose hands had last touched them. The rain had thickened into a fine curtain by the time Maigret left the wholesaler's yard, the gutters brimming once more, the air damp enough to make the wool of his coat cling at the shoulders. He did not hurry. His steps took him along the boulevard, where buses hissed on the wet asphalt, and clerks scurried past with umbrellas angled like shields. The day had turned grey and earnest, and yet he felt no urgency. The picture was still forming, and he knew that if he pressed too hard, the shapes would blur. Better to let them sharpen of their own accord. He turned into a café, one of those narrow places with frosted glass and a zinc counter that reflected the weak bulbs above. The air was heavy with the smell of wet coats, tobacco, and coffee grounds. A man in a stained apron was drying cups with a cloth that had seen better days. He looked up at the inspector with curiosity, but without alarm. Maigret was a familiar sight in such places, too familiar to draw comment. "Un demi," Maigret said, settling onto a stool. The barman drew it, the foam spilling slightly over the rim. "You knew Monsieur Bruce?" Maigret asked after a sip, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The man shrugged. "He played here, twice a week, always the same table, always the same cards, paid his round without fuss, though he counted his coins before ordering. A quiet fellow, he'd nod if you greeted him, but not more. Last night? Ah, yes, him and the tall one with the glasses. Vacheron. They came together, played a hand, left together. Nothing out of the ordinary. They didn't quarrel. No quarrels here, Inspector. If they quarrel, they go outside." He grinned with a kind of pride, as if keeping quarrels outside was his personal triumph. "They spoke much?" The barman shook his head. "No more than you'd expect. The tall one laughed once at something small, but Bruce, he seemed, how shall I put it, preoccupied. He looked at the clock twice, as if he was waiting for something or someone. Then he stopped and drank slow. The detail fit neatly with the others: the second cup on the table, the dry soles, the rinsed spoon. A man waiting, not for Vacheron, he had already arrived, but for another who had not come, or had come later. Maigret finished his glass, left a coin, and stepped back into the drizzle. He took the long way indeed, past the tabac where the owner, busy with customers, confirmed with a nod that Bruce had not bought cigarettes for days. A man who quits smoking often speaks of it, but he also often falters. Yet the pack on the counter of his room was untouched. It was another small thread. By the time Maigret reached Rue de la Glacière, the rain had eased again, leaving the pavements dark and shining. The boarding house looked unchanged, yet within he felt the air stir, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the earlier intrusion. Madame Tirard met him at the door, her shawl more tightly wound, her eyes restless with curiosity and fear. "You're back, Chief," she said, her voice low. "The young one next door, he's gone out. Jeanine still sleeps. The doctor hasn't returned. I kept everyone away, as you said." He nodded, removing his hat, and climbed the stairs slowly. The room had not altered. The body still sat at the table, the sugar lump untouched, the two keys side by side. Yet the air was different. He carried back into it the smell of damp paper, of ink, of numbers carefully written, of a man with threadbare suit and glasses returning a key. He closed the door behind him and stood for a long moment. He imagined the scene as it had been the night before. Two men, one pouring coffee, the other returning a key. The sound of rain on the window, the faint smell of tobacco not yet abandoned. Then departure, the door closing quietly. After that, silence. He walked to the window and opened it wider than before. The street below lay wet and hushed, a cat darting under a cart for shelter. He thought of Bruce asking Vacheron if he ever felt watched. The question hung in the room still, heavier than the smell of coffee. Watched by whom? By the landlady? By the boy next door? Or by someone unseen in the damp corridor, waiting for the tall man to leave? Maigret shut the window again and turned back to the table. He sat, just as the dead man sat, and placed his large hands on the oilcloth. He let the weight of the keys, the coffee, the shoes, the letter, all press against him without arrangement. Slowly, he began to feel their order. The door opened quietly. It was Janvier, rain dripping from his hat, his face alive with the energy of small discoveries. "Well?" Maigret asked, without rising. "The post," Janvier said. "The registered letter went out yesterday, just as the clerk said, addressed to his sister in Montluçon. She has not yet received it, of course, but she confirmed to the telegraph office that she expected something. He had written her last week, saying he had important matters to set straight." "Important matters," Maigret repeated, almost as if tasting the words. "And more. I asked discreetly at the grocer's where he bought his milk. Yesterday, just before noon, he bought only a half bottle, though usually he bought a liter. The grocer noticed. He said Monsieur Bruce joked he wasn't planning to be thirsty." The inspector's eyes half closed. "Not planning to be thirsty," he murmured. "And a registered letter sent, and two keys laid on the table." Janvier shifted. "You think he meant to end it himself?" Maigret did not answer at once. He leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight, his gaze resting not on the body, but on the sugar lump, still white, still defiant against the damp air. "If he did," Maigret said slowly, "he wished it to look like something else. Or if someone else helped him, they wished it to look like he had done it himself. In either case, the meaning lies in how it appears, not in how it happened." He rose then, placing his hat back on his head. "Stay here. Make sure no one disturbs the room. I'll be back." Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky above was the color of old tin, but the streets glistened with a softer light. Maigret walked to the corner and stood, looking back at the narrow building. He imagined the stair creaking at 11:30. Another visitor climbing after Vacheron had gone. A door closing softly, two keys on the table, now side by side. A man with dry soles, who had not gone out again. He lit his pipe at last, the match flaring briefly before the smoke curled upward. He drew it in slowly, the familiar taste grounding him. Somewhere within the drizzle-soaked air lay the truth of why two keys had been left and who they were meant to speak to. He would wait. He would listen. And the house, with its careful landlady and its whispering neighbors, would in time tell him everything. The pipe smoke lingered in Maigret's mustache as he stood on the corner, watching the wet facade of the boarding house. He had the sensation, familiar after years, that the house itself was withholding something, not maliciously, not even deliberately, but in the way walls keep secrets by simply standing still and letting lives happen inside them. People were small within such walls. They revealed themselves in fragments, in the shuffle of slippers at night, in cups rinsed or not. Rinsed, in doors locked or left ajar. He decided not to return inside at once. Instead, he turned into the small épicerie across the street, where the air smelled of coffee grounds and pickled vegetables. A woman in a black cardigan stood behind the counter, her hands red from the cold water of rinsing jars. She looked up sharply when the inspector entered, as shopkeepers do when they sense news has come close. "You served Monsieur Bruce yesterday," Maigret said, his tone conversational, as though they were two neighbors speaking about the weather. "I did," she answered at once, her voice a little too eager. "A half bottle of milk only. I told him it would sour before the next morning, but he only smiled. He said—" She hesitated, recalling the words precisely. He said, "Don't worry, madame. It won't be wasted." Maigret nodded slowly. "Did he look ill?" "Number tired, perhaps, but he always looked tired. A polite man, always said good day." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There was another just after he left, a woman. She asked if he had been there. I told her yes. She didn't buy anything. She left quickly." The inspector's heavy lids lifted a fraction. "Describe her." "Not young, not old. Perhaps 35, 40. Dark coat. A veil on her hat, though it was daytime. Nervous. She had an accent, I think, but she spoke little." "Had you seen her before?" "Never." He thanked her, bought a small packet of biscuits he did not need, and returned to the street. A woman, unknown, asking for Bruce after he left. That explained the waiting, perhaps the second cup, the shoes still dry. But why the veil? Why the haste? Back inside the house, the staircase carried the faint smell of cabbage now warming for lunch in some unseen kitchen. Janvier remained at his post, upstairs, leaning on the doorframe with that mixture of patience and curiosity young inspectors cultivated under Maigret. He straightened as the chief arrived. "No one's disturbed it," he said quickly. "The landlady tried to hover, but I sent her away, and the girl next door's awake now. The seamstress. She says she'll talk." Maigret entered the room first, glanced again at the two keys, unchanged, still speaking silently from the oilcloth, and then motioned for the girl to be brought. Jeanine Roux entered shyly, thin as her needles, her hair pinned carelessly, as if she had risen too fast. She wore a faded blouse with the collar frayed, and she smelled faintly of paraffin and lavender. Her eyes, though, were clear and direct. "You knew Monsieur Bruce?" Maigret said gently, offering her a chair but not pressing when she shook her head and remained standing. "As one knows a neighbor," she said. "I heard him cough sometimes. He kept quiet. He didn't bang his doors. He wasn't unkind. Last night," she twisted her fingers together, "I was sewing late. The lamp was on. Around 11 I heard voices in the corridor. 2 men. They went into his room. I heard the door. After that, only the murmur of speech. Later, another step. Lighter. A woman's, perhaps. I can't be sure. The door opened and closed again, but more softly. I thought I imagined it." "You did not see?" "Number I don't pry. The walls are thin enough. You hear too much if you listen." Maigret let the silence fall. She grew restless and filled it herself. But I smelled perfume. Not the sort I could afford. A little heavy, powdery. It lingered in the corridor. Perfume, a veil, a second cup. He nodded once, and she seemed relieved, as though giving away this piece had lifted some weight from her. "Thank you," he said, and she slipped out as quietly as she had come. When the door closed, Janvier leaned closer. "So there was a woman. Then perhaps—" Maigret shook his head slightly. "Perhaps is too large a word. She was here, yes. But whether she drank coffee or simply left perfume, we do not yet know. The truth is smaller. Always smaller than we think." He returned to the chair, sat heavily, and drew in a slow breath of pipe smoke. He pictured the sequence again: the walk from the wholesaler, the cafe, the return, the second key placed on the table. Vacheron leaving at 11:20, then the lighter step, the perfume, the second cup, the rinsed spoon, the untouched sugar. Janvier broke the quiet. Should we search the drawers? The trunk? There may be papers. Later, Maigret said. His tone was final but not harsh. He preferred to let the room reveal itself at its own pace. Forcing it would yield only noise. The rain had stopped outside, leaving the windows streaked and the light dim. A cart rattled past, and somewhere a child shouted. Within, the body sat unchanged, as though it listened too. A knock came at the door. Timid, Madame Tirard entered with a telegram slip in her hand, her face pale. It came just now for him, delivered to the front door. Maigret took it, unfolded it carefully. The message was brief. Arrive tomorrow afternoon. Need to speak urgently. Claire. No surname. No address. Only the name. Claire. The inspector folded it back, his thick fingers hiding the words, and placed it on the table beside the keys. Now there were 3 objects aligned. 2 keys, 1 telegram, each an unfinished sentence. Did the boy who delivered it say from where? Maigret asked. A post office near Gare d'Austerlitz. He didn't know more. Claire, the veiled woman, or someone yet to arrive, too late to meet him. A sister, a lover, a debtor. Maigret rose, adjusted his hat, and looked once more at the sugar lump. It sat between the keys and the telegram, a small square of whiteness, unyielding. We'll wait, he said to Janvier. People who write urgent telegrams cannot help but appear, and when she does, we'll see which key was meant for her and which for him. He stepped out into the corridor, leaving the Arpois, room behind him heavy with its own secrets. The house, he knew, would speak soon enough. The telegram sat in Maigret's pocket like a stone as he walked down the dripping street, his pipe clamped between his teeth, though he had not bothered to light it again. Claire. A name too bare to offer certainty, too intimate to belong to chance. He could feel already that she was part of the story, not a shadow glimpsed or a scent carried in a corridor, but someone who would step fully into the frame before long. And yet he did not rush. Rushing spoiled such arrivals. Better to let the city deliver her when it was ready, as it delivered everything else, slowly, amid the smoke and rain. He turned into a café, not the one where Bruce and Vacheron had played belote, but another nearby, quieter, its windows fogged from the stove within. He chose a corner table where he could watch the door and sat heavily, ordering a calvados that warmed him as much by its presence on the table as by the burn it promised in his throat. He let the glass rest there untouched, watching the swirl of condensation on the inside of the window, until the door opened and Lognon entered, shaking his coat like a dog. The inspector's face carried its usual gloom, though this time tinged with a reluctant satisfaction. He dropped onto the bench opposite Maigret without waiting for an invitation. I spoke with Montluçon, Lognon muttered, rubbing his chilled hands together. There is a sister, yes. Married, 2 children. She says she expected a letter from Etienne. He had written her already, saying he had something to put in order, something serious. She does not know what. He was never dramatic, she said. Always steady, always careful. Did she say when he last wrote? A week ago. It arrived Saturday. She showed it to the local police. They will forward a copy by post. Nothing in it except that line, I have something to settle. Maigret finally lifted the glass to his lips, swallowed, and set it down again with a soft clink. Something to settle, he echoed. And a registered letter sent yesterday, to her. Lognon gave a short, humorless laugh. Perhaps he sent her his savings, or his will, or the key to his room. We will know when it arrives. They drank in silence for a time. Around them, the café murmured with low voices and the scrape of chairs. Maigret let the rhythm of the place sink into him, the steady breathing of Paris in its ordinary habits, against which small tragedies made their outlines. Did you hear of a woman? Maigret asked quietly at last. Lognon raised his eyebrows. A woman. The grocer saw one, Dark coat, veil, asking for Bruce. The seamstress next door smelled perfume in the corridor about the time Vacheron left. Light footsteps too, and then this telegram from Claire. He tapped his pocket. She was expected. Longnon grimaced. Expected, perhaps, but not welcomed, or too welcomed. Women complicate everything. If it was a man with a knife, we would already be finished. Maigret allowed himself the faintest smile. Life is rarely so simple, Longnon. Even men with knives do not strike only because they have knives. The Calvados burned in his chest, steadying him. He stood and left coins on the table. "Come," he said. "We will wait." They returned to Rue de la Glacière together, walking slowly, the drizzle tapping on their hats. The boarding house loomed ahead, its windows dim, its staircase smelling of boiled cabbage and wet wool. Janvier was still upstairs, yawning but alert, and he straightened as Maigret entered the room again. "No change," Janvier said. "No one has come." "They will," Maigret murmured. He sat once more at the table, as if taking the place of the dead man, and lit his pipe at last. Smoke curled upward, mingling with the faint odor of coffee that still clung to the air. The body sat silent, the keys still lying neatly, the telegram now beside them. The afternoon wore on, the grey light dimming toward evening. At 5, footsteps sounded on the stairs, hesitant, pausing at each landing. A knock followed, soft, against the door. Janvier opened it, and a woman stood there, gloved, her coat damp, a small hat with a veil drawn low. "Claire?" Maigret asked, though he already knew. She nodded, her eyes dark behind the netting. She was not young, not old, the age the grocer had guessed. Her face was pale, her mouth tight, but she held herself with the restraint of someone used to keeping composure in rooms where she did not belong. "I had a telegram," she said simply. Her voice was low, steady. "From him. I came at once." Her gaze moved past them, fell on the figure at the table. She did not cry out, did not faint. She only drew in a sharp breath as if the air had struck her. Her gloved hands tightened on her small handbag. "He is dead," Maigret said gently. She nodded once. "I knew," she whispered, "or I feared. That is why I came." She stepped into the room, looked at the 2 keys, at the sugar lump, at the telegram lying beside them. Her eyes lingered on the keys, and she pressed her lips together. "Why 2?" Maigret asked, not harshly. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she removed her glove and touched one of the keys with the tip of her finger. "This one was mine. He gave it to me months ago when I needed somewhere. Just for an evening now and then, when the world was too heavy. He was kind, not romantic, not in the way people imagine. Kind. He let me have the key so I could come if I needed. But I returned it to him last week. I told him it was finished." "And yet you came yesterday," Maigret said softly. "Yes, because he wrote again. He asked me to. He said he must tell me something before it was too late. I came in the afternoon, but he was not here. I waited nearby, then returned in the evening. The landlady said nothing. I left. I thought he had changed his mind." "And you came again today, after the telegram," Maigret said. She nodded, her veil trembling slightly as she breathed. "Did you drink coffee with him last night?" "No," she said at once. "I never went inside. I told you, I left. I was afraid." Maigret studied her, the way she stood with her weight uneven, her eyes fixed not on the dead man but on the keys. He believed her, not because her words were flawless, but because of the small faltering gestures, the glove not fully pulled off, the way she pressed her lips to hide their trembling. "What was he to you?" Longnon asked abruptly, his voice sharper. She turned to him with quiet dignity. "A refuge. That is all. A man who listened without judging. Nothing more. Nothing less." The silence that followed was deep. Outside, the rain had begun again, softly against the window. Maigret rose, tapped his pipe against the ashtray, and looked once more at the objects on the table. 2 keys, 1 telegram, a sugar lump. He felt the weight of them settle into place. It was not yet the whole truth, but it was closer. And as he looked at Claire, standing there with her veil and her trembling hand, he knew the house had given up another of its secrets, and that the final one would not be long in coming. Claire remained standing, her back to the closed door, as though she were unsure whether she belonged inside the room at all. The still figure at the table seemed to keep her at a distance. She did not move closer, and Maigret, who had sat down again, made no attempt to urge her forward. He knew people revealed more by the space they chose to occupy than by words. Her silence was taut, but not evasive. She was not trying to conceal what she was, but rather to decide what she could bear to expose. He let the smoke of his pipe drift lazily toward the ceiling before speaking. "You say you returned the key last week. To him?" "Yes," she said, her voice muffled slightly by the veil. "I handed it back. He put it in his pocket. He seemed disappointed, but he didn't protest. And yet it is here on the table." She glanced at the 2 identical keys, her lips tightening. Then he must have taken it out again, put it there on purpose. Perhaps to show me if I came. Or to show someone else. Maigret shifted in his chair, heavy and deliberate. "When you first came here, why did he give you the key?" Her eyes lowered to her gloved hands, one bare now, the other still encased in damp leather. "Because he trusted me, and because he was lonely, that is all." The inspector's gaze rested on her, unblinking. She gave a faint sigh, then continued, "I'd left my husband. It was not a scandal. I doubt even the neighbors knew. I needed somewhere quiet, where no one asked questions. He was kind enough to give me that. He never asked for more than I could give." Lognon shifted impatiently, his gloom turning to suspicion. "And you expect us to believe you never quarreled? That you had no reason to—" But Maigret raised one large hand, silencing him without a word. His eyes never left Claire. "When you came yesterday evening, did you climb the stairs?" She hesitated. "Yes, I climbed. I stood outside his door. I was about to knock. Then I heard voices, his and another man's. I smelled the coffee through the gap at the bottom of the door. I turned and left. I had no wish to intrude." "The other man," Maigret said. "Tall, with glasses." She nodded faintly. "I saw him leaving as I reached the street. I kept to the shadows. He did not see me." "Why didn't you go back up after he left?" Her eyes flicked briefly to the still body at the table before she answered. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of what Etienne might say, afraid of what I might decide. It was easier to run. I thought I could return today, after his telegram, that it would be calmer." Her voice trembled for the first time, and she pressed the gloved hand against her mouth, holding in the sound. The silence in the room stretched, the faint crackle of the stove in the corridor carrying through the thin walls. Maigret leaned forward slightly, his heavy elbows resting on the oilcloth. "And what do you think he wished to tell you, this urgent matter?" Her eyes lifted then, dark and hollow. "Something about the past, something unfinished. He said once that mistakes weigh heavier than debts, that one can pay a debt but not undo a mistake. Perhaps he meant his sister. Perhaps he meant me. I will never know." Janvier, standing by the window, shifted his weight. "She could have entered after all," he muttered, but Maigret ignored him. He was watching Claire's hands, how one glove remained on, the other off, how she held her handbag not by its handle but pressed flat against her body like a shield. "Madame," he said at last, softly but with weight, "did you see what he wrote to his sister, the letter he sent yesterday?" Her head moved in a slow, uncertain shake. Number, he did not speak of it. He registered it, Maigret continued, which means he wanted to be certain it arrived, and yet what he left here, he gestured at the keys, the sugar, the body, seems to be speaking to you. Her lips parted, then closed again. She had no answer, or perhaps she had too many. Outside, a cart clattered over the cobblestones. Rain had begun again, more gently, as if the city were exhaling. Within the small room, the silence grew heavier until Claire suddenly straightened, gathering her coat more tightly. "I cannot stay," she said abruptly. "This is not my place any longer." Maigret rose slowly, blocking her path, though without menace. His bulk filled the narrow space between the bed and the door. "You will stay in Paris tonight?" She looked at him directly now, her eyes clear behind the veil. "Yes." He stepped aside, letting her pass. She moved quickly down the corridor, her heels clicking softly on the worn boards, and then the sound of her descent faded into the hum of the house. When she had gone, Lognon muttered, "She knows more than she says." They always do. Maigret, still gazing at the door, said nothing. He returned to the chair, relit his pipe, and let the silence settle again. He could feel the story turning, slowly, like a heavy wheel beginning its final rotation. Claire had not lied, not exactly, but she had not told all. That was enough for now. People could only hold silence so long. Eventually, it burst. He thought again of the dry soles, the second cup, the spoon rinsed but not wiped. He thought of the registered letter sent with such care, and of the telegram sent with such urgency. He thought of the two keys, laid side by side, not tossed. One returned by Vacheron, one meant for Claire. He imagined Etienne Bruce setting them down with deliberate hands. An unfinished statement. Janvier spoke quietly from the window. "So, Chief, do you think he meant to end it himself?" Maigret did not answer directly. If he did, he wanted someone to witness it, someone to understand. Otherwise, he would not have placed those keys. He would not have written. He would not have waited. The younger inspector frowned, not satisfied. But Maigret was no longer listening. His mind had shifted to the sister in Montluçon, to the letter she would open in a day's time. That letter, he knew, would carry the missing piece. Not a confession, not an explanation, but something smaller, more human. The kind of truth men leave behind when they are too tired to carry it further. For now, the room kept its vigil. The sugar lump still waited, stubborn and white, untouched. The body sat as though listening, and Maigret, pipe smoke drifting about his head, waited with them, knowing that the quiet weight of time would draw the rest of the truth into the open. Evening crept in without ceremony, thinning the light until the window turned the color of dishwater, and the room's corners grew soft. The house shifted almost imperceptibly as people returned from work. A heel paused on the landing, a cough, a door that closed with the special care of those who know the wall's thickness too well. Janvier lit the lamp, and its yellow circle settled over the table, warming the nickel heads of the keys until they looked almost tender. Maigret stood a long while, without moving. Then, as if he had been waiting for the room to invite him, he reached for the narrow trunk beneath the bed. He did not rummage. He lifted each item as a man lifts someone else's life. The shirts, ironed badly and folded carefully. A spare collar in a paper sleeve. A pair of socks darned with a steadier hand than the shirts had known. A cheap photograph album with only 3 photographs. One of a fieldstone house that could have been anywhere in the Auvergne. One of 2 children on a stoop, and one of a woman, middle-aged, squinting, into winter sun, her hair tied back. On the inside cover, in a hand that had pressed too hard, "Pour ma sœur," no name. Under the shirts, a flat packet of envelopes bound with string, all used, all with stamps soaked off. Receipts folded into strict rectangles. Rent 3 months without a gap. Coal from the yard in winter. A bill for a pair of rissoles at a cobbler's on Rue Monge. No extravagance, no debts that admitted themselves. A cloth purse held coins, 32 francs, and 2 notes, crisp from not being handled. At the very bottom, a cardboard sleeve meant for a savings book. The sleeve was empty, the cardboard slightly polished from being taken out and put back often. He held it in his palm, heavy in its emptiness, then slid it where it had been. Janvier had been watching without speaking. "Livret," he said softly. "Sent," Maigret answered, just as soft. "Registered." He closed the trunk and pushed it back with his foot. On the washstand, the bottle of aspirin rattled when he lifted it. 2 tablets, as before. He glanced at the tiny label of a pharmacy on Avenue des Gobelins, then set it back down. By the stove, the rinsed spoon still held the ghost of milk. He smelled it again, not because odors could accuse, but because they often remembered what people forgot. The corridor outside carried the sound of the landlady's steps. She did not knock. She hovered. Maigret opened the door for her. She came in with the eagerness of someone who wants to deliver a message before it dissolves. "The caretaker is back," she announced, whispering as if the dead could wake. "He says the locks are to be changed. He is angry. He says people talk." "People talk," Maigret repeated mildly, as if it were weather. She stood, clasping her apron. "It's not as bad as they say, Chief. The locksmith, years ago, he cut them to the same pattern. It was cheaper. We have not had trouble. Only once, a soap gone missing. Poor folk do not steal much. There is nothing to take." "Except when there is," Maigret said, his look moving to the trunk and bag. Her eyes followed and then skittered away. He was a good tenant. He didn't invite women, not often. The last words came out before she could help them. She caught herself and straightened. "If you want to see, you can try with the key. It opens Jeanine's room too. She told me once," laughing. "I told the caretaker." He shrugged. They went into the corridor. Jeanine's door stood shut, the little brass number dull in the lamplight. Maigret turned one of the keys, not fully, but enough to feel the familiar give of a lock that received what it should not. He did not push the door. He removed the key and returned it to the table. Proof did not need intrusion. The caretaker arrived at the threshold as they turned back, his cap in his hands, his face carrying the defeated belligerence of men whose authority is always smaller than their responsibility. He was broad without, being strong, a belly pushing against his vest, his cheeks roughened by shaving too quickly. "It's a disgrace," he began, and his voice had the tremor of someone who has rehearsed his grievance. "They say the police are sniffing because a man dies sitting up, as if men do not die sitting every day. It is the rain. It creeps into the bone. We are here because he left 2 keys, Maigret said, not unkindly. The caretaker's eyes darted to the table. 2 keys. There are hundreds, if you like. Everyone wants one. The milkman, the coalman, the boy with the newspapers. They all say they must leave things inside. The locksmith, may he choke. Cut them to the same teeth. I didn't ask him. The owner never pays for work to be done twice. And yesterday, Maigret asked, who had a key that was not their own? The man's hands worried his cap. The plumber, for the 3rd floor, a leak. He comes early, or he never comes. I gave him the building key. At what hour? 7, past. I start early. He said he liked to hear the sparrows. Did he come back for it? He left it on my table. I found it at noon. He is like that, always in a hurry. He leaves his tools. He comes back in a week, swears. What is his name? Maigret's voice was neutral. The caretaker flinched. Pichon or Pigeon? He calls himself many things. He's the kind who owes 3 landlords and pays 2. But he is cheap. He tightens a pipe and it stays tight until winter. Which flat had the leak? The caretaker's eyes slid away and were dragged back. There was no leak, he said, then immediately contradicted himself. Not exactly. The lady on the third says her sink makes a noise. They all say their sinks make noises when the rent is due. Madame Tirard made a small, outraged sound. You gave a key for nothing. For the sake of quiet, he protested, but his voice had faltered. Maigret did not press. He had learned that shame was like a knot. The more one pulls, the tighter it holds. Better to let it relax by itself. You will bring me his address, he said simply. Tonight, or in the morning. The caretaker nodded, watching the dead man as if the orders came from him. After he had gone, Madame Tirard stood very still. When she spoke, her voice had changed. It carried the small, fearful pride of someone who has chosen a side. He is lazy, she murmured, but he is not wicked. Maigret said nothing. In the room, the keys lay under the lamplight like two answers to a question not yet asked properly. The telephone on the ground floor rang with the nervous clang of instruments that never ring for good news. Maigret went down alone. The receiver was heavy and cold. The voice that came through it was warm and familiar. Will you be home for dinner? Madame Maigret asked, as if dinner were a place one visited rather than a meal. Not tonight, he said. He told her in 2 sentences. The kind of case it was. A man, a room, 2 keys on a table, a woman who came and did not enter. She made a small sound that was not quite a sigh. 2 keys, she repeated. That is what people do, you know, when they separate. They put the keys down and they go without a word. It is tidier than speaking. Tidier, he agreed. And sugar, she added after a moment, as if turning the room over in her mind. Who leaves sugar on the table if they live alone? Only if they expect a visitor who takes it. You do not. Neither did your mother. Remember when you stopped smoking, you ate sugar lumps for 3 days. You hated yourself for it. He smiled, though there was no one to see. It did not last. Nothing virtuous does, she said, and her tone carried no reproach. Come home when you can. He returned the receiver to its cradle, feeling the little click in his fingers. Back upstairs, the lamp had drawn people as a stove draws cold hands. Janvier stood where he had stood. Lognon had materialized again, his damp hat leaving a dark ring on the bedspread where he had put it without asking. The landlady hovered like a guardian in disgrace. Pichon, Maigret said simply, and the caretaker's name like a round stone dropped in a bucket. We will see him in the morning, at 7. To ask if he tightens pipes or doors? Lognon murmured, unable to resist. To ask who sent him, Maigret said. He sat and filled his pipe, tamping the tobacco with the care of a man putting earth back into a plant's pot. He did not light it. He looked at the keys, then at the telegram, then at the sugar lump, lining them with his eyes as if they were little soldiers on parade. He thought of his wife's remark, so simple and so undeniable that it rearranged the room without moving anything. Sugar means a visitor who takes sugar. 2 keys means 2 departures. He saw it then as Etienne must have seen it. The decision was made in steps too small to call decisions, to send away the livret for safekeeping, to write to a sister in words that promised nothing but carried their weight, to ask a friend to return a key, and to hope a woman would take hers and free him of its weight, to quit cigarettes because it felt like starting to end something. And then morning, the rain thinner, the house not yet fully awake, the door that admits plumbers and milkmen and whoever asks without asking too much, the ridiculous lock that is 2 locks with 1 bite. Someone comes. The coffee is made because people cling to habits even when they have put down keys. Sugar is set out, though he does not take it. There is talk or there is not. After, the spoon is rinsed without being wiped. It is the sort of order that the guilty like, a surface that tells a story they can believe themselves. What are you thinking? Janvier asked quietly, as if afraid of breaking something. That he did not want to die alone, Maigret said, and that he did not want anyone to be accused. So he set the table with an answer. You believe he chose it? Lognon's eyebrows rose. Men who choose it do not set sugar for ghosts. Men who choose it still hope, Maigret said. He hoped for understanding, not rescue. The younger men were silent. Outside, the rain resumed with a soft persistence, like someone who knocks and will not insist. Somewhere on the 3rd floor, a chair scraped. Somewhere below, a saucepan lid clinked against its rim. The house breathed. Tomorrow, Maigret said, almost to the room. We will talk to the plumber who arrives when sparrows wake. We will speak to the pharmacist who sells sleep to men who hate their beds. We will let the sister open her letter. He stood, his knees complaining a little. For tonight, the dead will keep what they can. He turned down the lamp until the light seemed to crouch over the keys. On impulse, before he left, he shifted them a finger's breadth closer until they touched. It was not an order, not evidence, not even a gesture a policeman should allow himself. It was an acknowledgement. In the corridor, Madame Tirard stood with her shawl tight and her mouth set. She had the look of someone who has understood that a fault is hers and no one will punish her for it because punishment would be a relief. "Will you arrest someone?" she asked in a small voice. "Yes," Maigret said, and his voice, though gentle, filled the stairwell. "But not tonight." She nodded, as if that were fair. And Maigret went down into the damp entrance hall where his hat waited and the street exhaled its cold on the glass, and he let the door close behind him with the quiet click of a lock that did too many jobs and did none of them well. Morning arrived grey and tight-lipped, the kind of Paris morning that seemed to rise from the gutters rather than the sky. Maigret was already on Rue de la Glacière when the milk cart rattled past and the first shutters opened with careful, sleepy hands. He had slept poorly, not for lack of tiredness, but because the rain had tapped his window like someone too polite to insist. He stood in the doorway of the boarding house, hat low, coat buttoned, listening to the building wake. A kettle beginning somewhere, a cough, the whisper of slippers. The caretaker came down with his vest misbuttoned and guilt already folded into his expression. He started at seeing Maigret, and then made the face people make when a punishment has not yet arrived, but has been expected too long. "Pichon will be here," Maigret said, as if he were talking about the weather. "You gave him 7. The caretaker nodded miserably and went to his little table to pretend to arrange tools. At 5 past, Pichon appeared with his bag and the air of a man who chose to be early so that others would think him conscientious. He was narrow where the caretaker was broad, his cap pulled too low, his coat sleeves polished at the cuffs by years of turning taps. He smelled of damp hemp and the sour sweetness of old pipes. He halted when he saw Maigret, shifted the bag to his other hand, and tried a smile that did not belong on his face. "Leak?" he said to the caretaker, as if the word could open a door for him that the man beside it would not. Maigret let the silence stand. He did not ask Pichon into the room with the keys. He took him instead to the ground-floor cubby that served as an office, where the lamp gave more shadow than light, and sat on the hard chair by the little iron stove. Pichon remained standing then, when no one gestured, sat on the edge of a wooden box and put his cap on his knee. "You were here yesterday," Maigret said. It was not a question. Pichon's tongue chased a crumb from one corner of his mouth to the other. "The 3rd floor. The sink rattles. The lady can't sleep. She hears water singing in the pipe." "What time did you come?" "Early," he said, obligingly vague. "I like to catch the day before it runs away." Maigret examined the man's fingernails, the half-moons of grime in the corners, the pale crescent of skin where a ring had once been and was not now. "The building key," he said. "You left it." "I always return keys," Pichon said quickly. "Ask anyone. I'm honest with keys." The word honest stumbled in his mouth and stood there awkwardly, unsure of itself. "Did you go upstairs?" Maigret asked, not moving, not hardening his voice. "Did you walk past the first-floor landing at 7? Pichon licked his lips. "I go where the pipes go. Pipes don't have floors. Men do." A draft moved under the door and lifted the corner of a calendar taped to the wall so that the month breathed once and lay flat again. Pichon's gaze flitted after it, then came back and fastened on the stove as if the iron held the answer to a question he had not yet been asked. "I saw the door," he said at last. "First floor. The room of the little clerk. It was shut, a light under it. You know how it is in the mornings. The house hasn't decided to be awake or asleep. I carry a box. I don't make noise." "Did you knock?" "I am not the postman," he said, almost offended. "I fix pipes." "Did you listen?" He opened his mouth, closed it again. "You hear things without wanting," he muttered. "What did you hear?" "A chair," he said. "A cup on a saucer. Nothing." "Smell?" Maigret asked, and the plumber looked at him sharply as if caught bending. "Coffee," he admitted, and then, after a beat, "and perfume." "Not my sort." A pause. The stove ticked as a coal settled. Upstairs, someone crossed a room with measured steps. The boards answered like an old friend. "You work cheap," Maigret said. "I work honest," Pichon corrected, more quickly than before. "You work where people keep their keys under clocks and their money under shirts," Maigret went on in the same mild tone. "You see envelopes with stamps. You know which rooms have 2 cups and which have 1. You know who comes early and who pretends not to." Pichon swallowed. The breath he drew sounded loud in the little room. "I'm not a thief." "No," Maigret agreed, and his approval was like a hand placed gently on a table. "You are not patient enough to be a thief. You are the kind who points and asks for a consideration not to point again." Pichon's eyes slid toward the caretaker's chair and away, as if to verify he was not being watched by the wrong man. "People don't pay plumbers," he said, sudden and defensive. "They say, 'Come tomorrow,' and then there is no tomorrow. I have children who eat today." "Do you have a wife?" "She left," he said flatly. "Then you know what keys mean." That landed. The man's shoulders sagged. "I never asked him for much," he muttered. "He is a clerk. What could he have? A little every month. Because—" he gestured vaguely toward the ceiling. "Because people talk. A lady in a veil. It is not my business to care, but it is my business to live. You know how it is." "So you waited at 7, Maigret said, not to accuse but to arrange. "With your bag. You knew his habit of coffee. You smelled perfume because perfume lingers longer than promises. You tapped. He opened." "I didn't go in," Pichon said too quickly. "I wouldn't. He gave me what he had in his pocket. He said he had sent the rest away, to be rid of me. He was polite, always polite, that one. He said it like a prayer. He looked tired. He told me not to come again." "What did you say?" "I said I would tell the caretaker about the lady. I said I would speak at the cafe. I said things men say when they don't want to leave empty-handed." He drew his fingers down his face as if he could pull the words off it. "He gave me 10 francs. 10! I put them in my pocket, and I went upstairs and banged the pipe on the 3rd floor so I could say I had done something. I came down at noon and left the key on the table." "And he was alive when you left?" Pichon stared at the stove. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its push. "He was already not here," he said softly. "He was sitting, the cup, the sugar. He looked at the table as if it were a letter he could not read." "Did you see what he drank?" Pichon shook his head. "I am not a doctor." "No," Maigret said, standing. "You are a man who asks too much from small lives." He did not raise his voice. He opened the door and told the caretaker to fetch the constable. Pichon made a small, hopeless movement that was not quite a step and not quite a shrug. "For what?" he asked in the tone of a child who has lied and been found. "For blackmail," Maigret said, "for having pressed a man until there was no more to press." The plumber's chin dropped into his palm. He stared at the floorboards as if searching for a nail to fix his eyes on. I didn't put anything in his cup, he said, the protest thin and frightened. I know, Maigret answered. Do you? He left the man sitting on the box with his cap in his lap and went out into the waking street. The air had the clean smell that comes after a night of rain. He walked to the pharmacy on Avenue des Gobelins, where the bell above the door gave a prim little warning of his entrance. The pharmacist, a pale man with a careful mustache and an apron too white for comfort, came forward with professional sympathy already shaped on his face. Somnifère, Maigret said, as if asking for matches. Sold this week to Monsieur Bruce on Rue de la Glacière. The man blinked, then reached for a ledger without argument. His finger ran down columns of names in little quantities in tidy script. Tuesday, he said, tapping. Powder, to be taken in milk. He has bought before, not often. He said he had trouble turning off his thoughts. Did you warn him? I warn everyone, the pharmacist said, insulted by implication. They nod and do as they please. Maigret thanked him, wrote no notes, and left with nothing in his hands. Outside, the day had crept into the second hour, when offices begin to fill with men who are 5 minutes late and look annoyed at the clocks for noticing. The world would go on around a single room, where a lamp still crouched over 2 keys. When he returned to the boarding house, Claire stood on the threshold, like someone who had returned to a church, thinking no one would see. Her veil was raised this time. Her face looked as if the night had passed over it and taken something with it. I could not sleep, she said, almost apologetically. I walked. I found my feet here. He did not stop her from going up. He followed at a distance that let her make her own way. In the room, Janvier had turned the lamp up a little to trick the morning, and the keys lay as Maigret had left them, touching. Claire's eyes went to that small correction and stayed. The sugar lump sat square and useless. She did not remove her gloves. He sent what he had, Maigret said, his voice low, as if they were talking in a library. To his sister, so that no one could take it from him. He asked a friend to return a key so that people would know the friend was not to blame. He hoped you would take the other with you and absolve him by leaving. He made coffee, and he put out sugar because you take sugar, and he had learned your habits and did not want to unlearn them. Then he waited. Others came who wanted something. You did not. In the morning, he drank what would let him stop. It was not a crime in the way people like to imagine crimes. It is something smaller and heavier. Claire's shoulders loosened, the breath leaving her almost as a sound. I told him it was finished, she said. I thought I was being brave. One must be tidy, I told myself. I put down the key. I did not know that putting it down would feel like a blow. He did not want to die alone, Maigret said, but he wanted no one to be punished for not saving him. He arranged a scene that could be read and trusted that someone would read it. Her eyes filled, but the tears did not fall. She nodded once, then again, almost imperceptibly, as if agreeing to a sentence that contained no verbs. She reached out and with one gloved finger touched the closer of the 2 keys, the tiniest gesture, like saluting. Her finger hesitated above the sugar and drew back. There was a knock at the door. Lognon came in with his habitual dampness, carrying an envelope with the Mont-Luçon postmark clinging to it like a label on a jar. Photostat, he said, almost apologetic for being useful. The sister sent a copy by wire. Maigret took it and unfolded the grey sheet on the table. The words were few and pressed. Ma chère Louise, I have put things in order so that you will not be troubled. Forgive the silence I have kept about my life here. It was a small life. Keep the book for the children. Tell them their uncle knew how to add without stealing. Etienne. Claire read without touching the paper. Her mouth trembled when she reached the last line. He was proud of that, she whispered, adding without stealing. So am I, Maigret said. He folded the paper, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it beside the keys. For a moment, the three lay together with the obstinate neatness of a clerk who had arranged them with care. The room held its breath and then released it, as if something long delayed had decided to happen very quietly. Downstairs, there was a movement, the scrape of a chair, the cautious weight of footsteps that announced the arrival of bureaucracy. Men would come to carry away what was left to carry. Pichon would be taken to a station where a charge would be named in a voice that could make even petty sins sound like crimes. A sister would receive a registered packet that was heavy with its own emptiness. A woman would fold a veil and put it away at the bottom of a drawer and take it out again on Sundays without knowing why. Maigret stood, his knees stiff from sitting, and looked around the room once more. He saw the cracked basin, the folded towel, the matchbox under the chair leg holding wobble at bay, the photograph with winter sun. The rain had stopped. The window held a dull, even light. He put on his hat, not because there was weather, but because it was time to go back into the world. "Janvier," he said, "you will see the papers. Be kind to the landlady." "And the keys?" Janvier asked softly. "They go to the sister," Maigret answered. "Let her decide whether they open anything." On the landing, Claire lingered, her gloved hand on the banister. She looked at Maigret as one looks at a doctor who has told a truth that is not a cure. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he asked, gently. "For not making it uglier," she said. "For letting it be what it was." He nodded, his mouth twisting into something that might have been a smile if it had learned how. He descended into the narrow, resigned hallway and stepped out into a morning that had finally remembered how to be a day. The city had already forgotten the rain. It remembered only that people must work and eat and go on. He walked toward the boulevard in his slow, patient way, the taste of smoke and weak coffee still in his mouth, and felt the quiet weight of a small life settle where he kept such weights, not in his pocket, but a little behind his ribs. The sky had cleared by the afternoon, a brittle kind of blue showing through between chimneys, as though Paris itself had grown weary of the rain. The boarding house had emptied of its watchers. The landlady no longer hovered. Janvier had gone with the constable to deliver Pichon into custody, and Lognon, grumbling as always, had trailed off with his papers, certain the case was too small to have occupied so much time. The room on the first floor stood quieter now, its lamp extinguished, its air returning slowly to the ordinary mix of damp walls and faint soap. Maigret lingered alone. He had a habit, unspoken, of staying after everyone else had gone, as if to give the dead man company for a last hour before he was carried away. He sat again at the table, his large hands spread flat on the oilcloth, his pipe unlit beside them. The keys lay where he had placed them, touching now, the telegram folded against them, the sugar lump stubbornly refusing to melt into anything. He could see it all as it had been, clear enough to feel almost present. Etienne Bruce, careful clerk, sitting here with the weight of silence on his shoulders, arranging his last little gestures, sending the livret to his sister, asking Vacheron for the return of the extra key, hoping Claire would take hers. The coffee boiled, 2 cups laid, sugar waiting. But when she left without entering, when the plumber came to take his small cut of misery, it was already too late. The powder in the milk was his own choice, tidy, unobtrusive. The scene he left behind was not a cry of despair, but a small accounting, the sort a man makes who has lived in ledgers all his life. There was no murderer to catch, not in the way the press liked to imagine. Pichon's greed was squalid, but it had not been the hand that pushed. Vacheron's friendship was thin, but not false. Claire's departure had wounded, but not destroyed. It was the man himself who had chosen the moment, weary of carrying a life that weighed little but felt heavy all the same. At length, Maigret stood. He picked up the keys, heavy in his palm for such small things, and slipped them into the envelope with the letter copy. They would go to the sister in Montluçon, along with the livret already on its way. Let her children play with them if they wished, opening nothing but drawers and cupboards in their own house. Let them rust quietly in a box. He took one last look around. The bed neatly made, the basin cracked but clean, the matchbox under the chair leg, the little photograph album. It was all ordinary, painfully ordinary, and that was what made it so heavy. He replaced his hat on his head and left the room, closing the door gently behind him, as if he feared to wake someone. Outside, the street was drying. The cobblestones gleamed under the thin sun, and the gutters no longer gurgled. He walked slowly toward the boulevard, pipe clamped between his teeth, though he did not light it. His thoughts were not of triumph, nor of justice won, but of the small human stubbornness that carries people through long years only to falter when no one notices. He would go home now. His wife would have supper waiting, and she would ask, without asking, what kind of case it had been. He would tell her only that it was finished, and that a man had left 2 keys on a table. She would nod, as she always did, and the silence between them would carry the rest. As he turned the corner, the wind lifted faintly, carrying with it the smell of roasted chestnuts from a vendor's brazier. Life went on around him, indifferent and endless. He drew in a long breath, let it out, and walked on, carrying with him nothing more dramatic than the quiet weight of another life ended, another riddle solved, not by fingerprints or pistols, but by listening long enough for silence to explain itself. To explain itself, 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 to explain